The greatest opera singer in the world stood in front of 50,000 people and said, "Tonight, I have brought someone who taught me what it means to truly perform." Then, Luciano Pavarotti introduced James Brown to an audience that had never heard soul music before. What happened in the next 20 minutes didn't just bridge two musical worlds. It proved that greatness speaks a universal language, and left Pavarotti in tears, telling Brown something he'd never told another artist. It was September 1992 in Modena, Italy. James Brown was 69 years old, still performing, still electrifying audiences around the world. But in America, his moment seemed to have passed. The music industry had moved on to hip-hop and R&B that sampled his sounds, but didn't honor his legacy. Younger audiences knew his beats, but not his name. It was a strange kind of fame, being foundational but forgotten, being everywhere and nowhere at once. Luciano Pavarotti wanted James Brown to perform at his annual charity concert, Pavarotti and Friends. The event raised money for children in war-torn countries and typically featured opera singers, classical musicians, and maybe a pop star or two. But soul music, American soul music from the 1960s, that had never been part of the program. Brown's manager was skeptical. "James, I don't know about this. It's an opera crowd. 50,000 Italians who came to hear Pavarotti sing Puccini. They're not going to know your music. They might not even respect it." But Brown had learned something over his decades in music. Real artistry transcends genre, language, and expectation. If Pavarotti wants me there, there's a reason. I'm going. When Brown arrived in Modena, a beautiful medieval city in northern Italy, he was struck by how different everything felt from the venues he usually played. This wasn't a sweaty club or an American arena. This was European elegance, Renaissance architecture, a crowd that wore suits and dresses to outdoor concerts and sat reverently through 3-hour performances. Pavarotti met Brown at his hotel the day before the concert. The opera legend was larger than life, literally and figuratively. 6 feet tall, nearly 300 pounds, with that famous smile and those eyes that showed he genuinely loved every person he met. When Pavarotti saw Brown, he didn't shake his hand. He bowed. "Maestro," Pavarotti said, using the Italian word for master. "It is the greatest honor of my life to have you here." Brown was taken aback. He'd been called many things: the godfather of soul, the hardest working man in show business, Mr. Dynamite, but he'd never been called maestro by someone of Pavarotti's stature. "Mr. Pavarotti, the honor is mine. You're one of the greatest voices in the world." Pavarotti shook his head vigorously. "Please, call me Luciano, and I must tell you something. I have studied your performances for many years. I have watched your concerts on video hundreds of times. You have taught me more about connecting with an audience than any opera teacher ever could." Brown didn't know what to say. This was Luciano Pavarotti, the man who could fill any stadium in the world, who sang for presidents and popes, who was as close to royalty as a musician could be. And he was saying he learned from James Brown? "Luciano, I appreciate that, but what could I possibly teach you? You're opera. I'm soul music. We're in different worlds." "No," Pavarotti said firmly, sitting down and gesturing for Brown to join him. "That is what people think, but it is not true. We are in the same world. The world of making people feel something they have never felt before. The world of giving everything of yourself to the people watching. You do this better than anyone I have ever seen." Over dinner that night, Pavarotti explained his philosophy. "In opera, we have this terrible tradition of standing still. We plant our feet, we open our mouths, and we sing. Very boring, very stiff. But you move like the music is inside your body trying to get out. You make every moment visual, emotional, impossible to ignore. This is what performance should be. But Luciano, your voice, when you sing, people cry. You don't need to move. The voice does everything." "The voice is only part of it," Pavarotti insisted. "Music is not just sound. It is presence. It is energy. It is the connection between the performer and the people. I can have the most beautiful voice in the world, but if I do not give my soul to the audience, what is the point? You understand this. Every time you perform, you give your soul. This is why I wanted you here. The next day, Brown rehearsed on the outdoor stage that had been built in Modena's main square. The sound crew didn't quite know what to do with him. They were used to opera singers with powerful but controlled voices. Brown's screams, his rhythmic grunts, his dynamic range that went from whisper to explosion in seconds, it challenged their technical setup. Pavarotti came to the rehearsal and watched from the audience area. When Brown finished running through "I Got You, I Feel Good," Pavarotti applauded enthusiastically. "Perfetto, perfect, this is exactly what I hoped for." Brown's manager pulled him aside during a break. "James, I'm worried. The crowd tonight, they're not your people. They're opera fans, classical music lovers. They might not understand what you do." Brown looked out at the empty square, imagining it filled with 50,000 Italians who had never heard his music before. "Then I'll make them understand. That's what I do. I make people understand." That evening, as the sun set over Modena, the square filled with people, families, elderly couples, young professionals, all settling into their seats or standing room spots. The concert began with opera, powerful voices singing Italian arias, the crowd listening with that particular European attention that comes from centuries of appreciating classical music. Brown watched from backstage, feeling the nervousness that still came before every performance, even after 50 years. Pavarotti found him in the wings. "Are you ready, my friend?" "As ready as I'll ever be, for 50,000 people who don't know who I am." Pavarotti smiled. "They are about to know exactly who you are." When it was time for Brown's introduction, Pavarotti walked to center stage. The crowd gave him the warm applause reserved for a hometown hero, which he was in Modena. "My friends," Pavarotti said in Italian, which was then translated on screens around the square, "tonight I have brought someone very special. Someone who many of you may not know, but who I consider to be one of the greatest artists alive. He is not opera. He is something different. But he is what I aspire to be, a performer who gives everything, holds nothing back, and makes you feel alive just by watching him. Tonight, from America, the legendary James Brown." The applause was polite but uncertain. These people had come to hear Pavarotti and opera. Who was this James Brown? Brown walked onto that stage knowing he had 20 minutes to win over a crowd that had no reason to care about him. He was 69 years old, wearing one of his sharp suits, hair perfect as always, carrying the weight of a lifetime of performing on his shoulders. The band started "I Got You, I Feel Good," a familiar song to American audiences, but to most of these Italians, completely new. Brown started moving, and something magical happened. It didn't matter that they didn't know the song. It didn't matter that he was singing in English, and they spoke Italian. It didn't matter that this was soul music, and they came for opera. Within the first minute, people were tapping their feet. Within 2 minutes, they were clapping along. Within 5 minutes, they were standing. Brown did what he always did. He gave everything. Every spin, every scream, every drop to his knees, every moment of controlled chaos that made his performances legendary. He wasn't performing for 50,000 strangers. He was performing for 50,000 people he was about to make family. Halfway through Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, Brown could see it happening. The transformation he'd seen 1,000 times in 1,000 different venues, but never quite like this. Italian grandmothers were dancing. Businessmen in suits were throwing their hands in the air. Young people were screaming like they were at a rock concert. In the wings, Pavarotti was watching with tears running down his face. "Luciano, why are you crying?" "Because I was right," Pavarotti said, not taking his eyes off Brown. "I told them he was a master. And look, they understand. They feel it. This is what I wanted them to see. This is what performance is supposed to be. Brown closed with Sex Machine, and by the end, the entire square was on its feet, moving, screaming, celebrating. These opera fans, these classical music lovers, these sophisticated Europeans, they were losing their minds for soul music from 1960s America. When Brown finished, the ovation lasted 6 minutes. Pavarotti walked onto the stage and embraced Brown, lifting him off the ground, despite Brown's protests. "Maestro," Pavarotti shouted into the microphone, "did I not tell you? Did I not say he was the greatest?" The crowd roared their agreement. Later that night, after the concert ended and the crowds dispersed, Brown and Pavarotti sat together in a quiet room backstage. Pavarotti was still emotional. "James, I need to tell you something I have never told another artist. When I first saw your performance on video, years ago, I wept. Not because it was sad, but because it was true. You showed me what I was missing in my own performances. I was technically perfect, but emotionally safe. You taught me to be dangerous, to risk everything for the connection with the people. Tonight, watching you win over my Italian people who had never heard your music, I wept again. Because you proved what I have always believed, that greatness is universal, that soul is soul, whether it comes from an opera or from funk music." Brown was quiet for a moment, processing this confession from one of the world's most celebrated artists. "Luciano, you honor me with those words, but I have to tell you something too. Watching you perform earlier tonight, hearing the way you connect with your voice to people's hearts, you do the same thing I do. You just do it different. We're both trying to touch people's souls. You use Puccini, I use funk, but we're reaching for the same thing." "Exactly," Pavarotti exclaimed. "This is what people do not understand. They put music in boxes. Opera here, soul music there, classical here, popular there. But the greatest music, the truest music, it breaks the boxes. It finds the universal human heart. And tonight," Brown said, smiling, 50,000 Italians who came to hear opera discovered they also love soul music. And more important," Pavarotti added, "they discovered that the two are not so different, that a man screaming 'I feel good' and a man singing an Italian aria are doing the same thing, celebrating being alive, celebrating emotion, celebrating the human experience." They sat together for another hour, two legends from completely different worlds, talking about music, performance, life, and the burden of being great at something. Pavarotti shared stories about the pressure of opera, the judgment from purists when he tried to do popular concerts. Brown shared stories about the racism he'd faced, the struggle to be taken seriously as an artist rather than just an entertainer. "You know what the hardest thing is?" Brown said. "Being a pioneer. Because pioneers get forgotten. The people who come after get to build on what you created, and they get celebrated for it. But the person who broke the ground, sometimes they get left in the ground they broke." Pavarotti nodded. "In opera, we have the same problem. The old masters are worshipped, but they are dead. The living artists who try to evolve the form, who try to bring it to new audiences, we are called sellouts, commercials, as if making people happy and making art are opposites." "So what do?" Brown asked. "We do what you did tonight," Pavarotti said. "We perform with everything we have, regardless of whether people understand us or appreciate us. We trust that greatness will eventually be recognized, and we find joy in the moment, in the connection, in the knowledge that for 20 minutes tonight, you made 50,000 Italians forget everything except the joy of being alive. That is immortality, my friend. Not what they write about us in history books, but what we make people feel in the moment." Brown smiled. "You're pretty wise for an opera singer." Pavarotti laughed. "And you are pretty sophisticated for a soul singer." The next day, Italian newspapers were filled with stories about the concert. Critics who had been skeptical about including James Brown in an opera event wrote glowing reviews. Brown proved that soul music and opera shared the same DNA, the desire to move people, to make them feel, to transcend the ordinary. One reviewer wrote, "Pavarotti gave us his voice, Brown gave us his soul. We needed both." Years later, Brown would say that the Pavarotti concert was one of the most important performances of his career. Not because it was the biggest crowd or the most famous venue, but because it proved something he'd always believed: that real music, honest emotion, and genuine performance transcend every boundary humans try to create. And Pavarotti, until his death in 2007, would tell anyone who asked that James Brown taught him the most important lesson of his career: that technique without soul is just noise, but soul without shame, soul given freely and completely, is the closest thing to divine that humans can create. If this story about two legends from different worlds finding brotherhood in their shared dedication to performance moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that greatness speaks a universal language. Subscribe for more stories about artists who broke boundaries and proved that soul is soul, regardless of the genre. And remember, the barriers between us are smaller than we think. Music, real music, doesn't recognize borders.